Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, I'm on with Dr. Nathan MacDonald. We're going to be talking about the question of monotheism. Is there monotheism in the Bible? Is it just one God? Is it multiple gods? Is there one God at the top and other lower gods? How are you doing today, Dr. MacDonald?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Nice to be with you.
Pleasure to have you on here. So, this is what you wrote your dissertation about, the topic of monotheism and Deuteronomy. Could you just talk about just the various, big claims that you made in your work and your doctoral research on the topic?
Sure, thank you. So this is going back almost 25 years now when I wrote this. So it came out in 2022. It's a PhD I did in Durham under Walter Mobley. And the book is called Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism. So and that last part is very important. What exactly do we mean by the term monotheism? It's a word that has its own history, its own place within early modern the early modern intellectual world, and it is a word that has often been applied to biblical texts and often used as a sort of yardstick by which to assess them. Is this a monotheistic claim? Is this not a monotheistic claim? Is it more polytheistic? And really what I wanted to do in the book was to think a little bit about the implications of that terminology, its kind of hermeneutical appropriateness, whether it was a great term to sort of apply to the biblical text, and whether at times it sort of thinned out the sort of the richness and the complexity of the kinds of things that the biblical text was seeking to claim. And so I used Deuteronomy as a particular case study for that, because Deuteronomy has various kind of complexities to it, but it does make several claims that have often been understood as monotheistic, or rather like monotheism. I suppose I could have chosen another book. Second Isaiah, of course, is another. Isaiah 40 to 55 is another text that's often thought about in this context, or even some of the texts in Kings that talk about God and make certain claims about his uniqueness. So that was really what the book was trying to do.
Much appreciated. And just for some clarity there, could you just give what was your main findings there? So did you conclude, hey, the text is monotheistic? Could you just give us your 1 minute summary of that?
Yeah, so I found myself fairly cautious about using the vocabulary of monotheism and using it in relation to Deuteronomy. I think that's particularly because it, to my mind, especially emphasizes, I suppose, intellectual and conceptual aspects. So it's very much concentrated on the sort of theism aspect of monotheism. The belief that there is one God, rather than say various of the other things that Deuteronomy is also concerned about, which is what the Israelites do, the direction of their affections towards God and to their fellow Israelites. So the vocabulary, it seems to me, it just needs to be used with care and with caution and with reflection about what we mean by it. What I didn't want to do, and I'm not sure that was always well understood by people who read it. What I wasn't trying to do was prohibit people from using the word. I'm not sure it makes a great deal of sense to tell people they can't use certain words, because you can guarantee the first thing they'll do is use them to show you that they can. So I don't think prohibiting the word is of much use. I don't think there's any points turning around and kind of saying, we shouldn't use monotheism of the Bible. What I really wanted to do, say to people, was, well, we need to think really what we mean by this term, particularly in light of its intellectual history. It's not an ancient word. It's a word that was coined in the middle part of the 17th century in Cambridge, as it happens. So it's one of those things that Cambridge has bequeathed to the world, and it belonged in a particular intellectual context in the 17th century, and it was also then developed and used in the 19th century to tackle a different set of intellectual concerns. And neither of those intellectual concerns, either in the 17th century or in the 19th century, maps straightforwardly onto what Deuteronomy is doing. Mm. So if we think about the 17th century, so the word monotheism is really, it's invented by somebody called Henry More, who was a Cambridge Platonist. So he's a group that's flourishing around the same time as the Puritans. And he and his fellow Platonists are really interested in carving a different intellectual path than the Puritans. They want to bring together a constructive faith, but they want to do that in dialogue with some of the developments that are going on at the time in science. This is the age of Newton, Locke, other great Descartes, other developments. But he and his Cambridge Platonists, More and his Cambridge Platonist friends, are concerned about the potential implications of things like Cartesian philosophy. They're worried that this is opening the door to sort of materialism and to atheism. There's a little sort of anxiety sitting in the background also about Islam. And there is also at this time the discovery of the New World. And there's a realization that the world is, there are different groups around the world who believe different things. So this is almost like the beginnings of the study of religion. Very rudimentary, because they're mostly using the study of religion in other places to make polemical points against their opponents. And monotheism is one of these words that they employ. So monotheism for them is sometimes being deployed against polytheism, but actually more often is being employed against materialism and against atheism, and occasionally in a sort of defensive apologetic claim against Islam, to say, what, we really are monotheistic. You're not the only ones who can claim a monotheism. We believe in the Trinity, but actually this is a monotheistic belief. So it's an interesting set of ideas emerging at a very intellectually fruitful period, but it's what it's a strategy for trying to categorize religion in a world that is beginning to become more complex. And I was really taken by the language that Nicholas Lash had used, several years before I wrote the PhD, of describing this kind of approach as a simple solution to a complex world. Faced with the complex world of religions that was just becoming apparent to them, how do you classify these? And particularly, how do you classify them if you're a Christian who wants to defend Christianity? And they do this by classifying everything by its relationship to how many gods you believe in. So, one God, that's us, we're monotheists, everybody else polytheist, and you can categorize them in this way. So I like that vocabulary, that it's a simple solution to a complex world, but it maximally focuses on intellectual ideas, and maximally on one particular intellectual idea is, do you believe in one God or in several gods? And the question is, does that give us a good understanding of other religions? And the answer is almost certainly not, because nobody who, this is a kind of internal Christian way or an internal Western way of categorizing religious belief. A polytheist is not going to sit there and say, I'm a polytheist, because that's not, they wouldn't articulate belief and practice and religion in that sort of way. But it makes sense within a Christian context, which has maximally emphasized belief, and in particular belief about deity. It makes sense within that context to understand others as polytheistic, but actually, does it make sense of the diversity, the complexity of the Christian tradition, or even the diversity and the complexity of biblical texts? So that's one context. That's the 17th century intellectual context in which this idea is birthed. And then there is the 19th century context in which monotheism becomes part of a sort of an evolutionary system. in one or two different directions. One direction is it's very often seen as the sort of the pinnacle of an evolutionary development. So you sort of start off with sort of animistic beliefs, the idea that sort of everything is inhabited by spirits and you do homage to spirits, and this is some sort of early belief of mankind, which then develops to a sort of polytheism, and then eventually perhaps towards a sort of monolatry and emphasis on just one god while allowing that other gods exist. And eventually there's a breakthrough to monotheism. And this proves quite popular with several 19th century thinkers because, I mean, particularly Old Testament scholars, because this provides some, in a context where critical thinking is emerging and doubts are emerging about whether, in fact, the Bible is historically true. Did the flood really happen? Was there were the patriarchs actually around? Is the Bible literally true in the way that people had thought? Then at least these scholars could say, well, the Bible, the Old Testament provides us with monotheism, and it's a kind of gift that is then bestowed to the New Testament writers, who then move it on in a different way towards a Trinitarian theology. So that's one model. You kind of see monotheism as a sort of end of an evolutionary process. The alternative is to see monotheism as a sort of original idea that early humanity had, a sort of instinctual belief in just one God, which was then corrupted. So this becomes almost a story of a sort of an originally good theological creation followed by a fall narrative. So monotheism is both a pure intellectual commitment to one God, which has kind of been lost by the corruption of subsequent religious belief or priesthood or whatever it might be. So again, it's kind of belonging within an evolutionary framework, but also one that is occasionally making certain kind of polemical points, or is sort of, I suppose, kind of apologetic. It's trying to provide a defense of a certain notion of kind of Christianity or certain defense of the Old Testament or of the Bible. So, all of this is part of that sort of intellectual context in which monotheism has been used. And so what I wanted to do in the initial part of the PhD was just to examine some of that intellectual context, and then to ask the question, what happens when we bring this terminology and apply it to the text? And I suppose some scholars might say, well, I can just leave all that baggage behind, and maybe they can, but yeah, sometimes words do sort of bring things along with them, and that was very much my concern, that it was really maximally focusing on certain kinds of intellectual ideas.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that a lot of these times you have these polemical environments where you're trying to use something to justify basically attacking other people. I've noticed that usually doesn't end too well as far as actually getting at what the text has to begin with.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I there's an extent to which I don't, we can't read the text simply on their own terms, and even what I was trying to do was not reading a text on its own terms, but we do have to be cognizant of those larger intellectual movements of which we're part, and even nothing occurs in a vacuum, and we many scholars are working, trying to defend an area against another area, even those who are seeking to do biblical scholarship in a non-confessional way are very often, either often inadvertently responding to that larger context from which they may well have come themselves existentially, or because it's part of the larger environment into which they're trying to provide a different way of going about things. So it's a challenge for all of us, however we're, whatever particular kind of contribution we're trying to make within the field, particularly within biblical studies. Biblical studies always has these larger questions of history and context and theology sort of pressing down on it.
Right. Yeah, it's really difficult to avoid. So that kind of brings us to what you concluded with your work. So did you ever settle on a specific view of how you think the word monotheism should be used? Or before we get into the specific text, could you maybe talk about what your view is on that?
Yeah, I suppose if I came for a preference for any term, it would be something like monolatry. I'm not the only scholar who's tended to prefer that term, because I'm not sure that any Israelite or Judahite in the first millennium BCE kind of, if asks, do other gods exist or not, I don't know that any of them would ever have said none exist. But plenty of those authors that we find whose writings are preserved in the biblical text are in different ways and more or less monolatrous in their thinking and in the writings that we find in the Hebrew Bible. And by monolatrous, what I mean is that they are convinced that only one deity should be worshipped, and that is Israel's deity, the Lord. And we would struggle, I think, to even those who think that we have monotheistic statements in the Hebrew Bible, we would struggle to say that we have a consistently monotheistic view. There are several texts that suggest or imply the existence of other deities, or don't necessarily see their existence as a problem per se, but that Israel should be committed and worship only one God. So it's a question of, if you like, it's a question not of intellectual belief but of loyalty.
Right. Yeah, so I think that might make people a little uncomfortable to think like, hey, the Bible says that there's only one God in multiple different places. And I think people also have this idea that, hey, gods are supposed to be worshipped. And you're saying that if there's multiple gods, then that means the Bible's saying that gods should be worshipped. But you're not saying that, so that feels a little weird. But could you talk about maybe the comfort or discomfort that you've noticed people have with this idea, and what you think about it, and how you kind of resolve that in your head?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few different approaches to this. One is that in terms of the sort of broad span of Christian history, Christian thinkers have never denied the existence of other supernatural beings, whether they're called angels or demons or whatever. This has never struck Christians as deeply problematic to acknowledge the existence of other supernatural beings. But on the other side, but also I think I would want to sort of point to certain biblical texts that would say, intellectual, actually, there's no text in the Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament that thinks belief is just enough. It's not just about belief. Even the devils believe and tremble. And even someone like Paul will say, there are many gods and there are many lords. And then follows on with, but for us there is one God and one Lord. So it seems to me that I think you're right that when I speak about what I've done my work on, the instinctual reaction from many Christians is to say, "Oh, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. This was not what we were taught." But actually, in many ways, it is consistent with what many people do believe and their practice. I mean, if you'll hear many sermons in Christian churches about money being a god, acting equivalently as a god, or power being a god. So I think we're quite used to the fact that actually intellectual belief is not enough, and that what is required is an orientation of life, a commitment, loyalty to God, and indeed that makes a lot of sense of the kinds of rhetorical claims that are made in the Bible, that and in various biblical texts, that that in various biblical texts there does appear a belief that God is not like any other God, that he is unique and supreme, but there are other potential, I suppose, gods with a small g, who might make a claim on our loyalty, including, of course, in the New Testament at the time, the Roman emperor. But the Christian belief and the Jewish belief in the first century as well was that this kind of loyalty and worship and devotion was only to be shown to the God of Israel, and that Christians and Jews, if firmly resisted showing worship to any other divine being or human come divine being like the Roman emperor. So I think I would hope with a little bit of explanation, the ideas wouldn't seem entirely alien and actually consistent with what with what we see in the first century, what we see in the New Testament, and also what we see in various parts of Christian history.
Yeah, so you're not saying that we should worship other gods. You're still saying you should only worship the Christian God, or the biblical writers were only worshiping one God. And then you also said that people in the past, Christians all throughout history, have believed in demons and angels and all the other kind of supernatural beings. And all you're saying is that, hey, the biblical writers seem to call those beings gods.
Yeah.
So we should use what the biblical writers were thinking about that, even if they didn't specifically worship it, except for the rebels, the ones that go and bring about the calf or whatever.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know your position on that.
we've got plenty of we've also got plenty of biblical texts that are fairly realistic about the kinds of activities that are going on in ancient Israel. There are plenty of Israelites that are, at least on the account of various biblical texts, worshipping deities that they ought not to have worshipped. And there's something about the kinds of it then makes more sense of the kinds of claims that are being made in various biblical texts, even those that sort of are most strongly I mean, sometimes almost a kind of a rhetoric of monotheism, let's maybe put it that way, that are most sort of most rhetorically insistent, we might say, on kind of there being one God. Even those are placing in front of the people an existential choice. So if we might think of Elijah on Mount Carmel, where he's confronting the prophets of Baal, and that competition is turning on who is, in the vocabulary that Elijah uses, who is the God with a capital G. So it is a claim about supremacy and uniqueness, but also that for that claim to make any sense, Baal must be a real opponent. There must be, you must sort of sit and think, well, actually, worshipping Baal has some appeal to it. And Elijah is trying to win that battle, and he's not doing it by kind of saying, well, actually, let's think about this philosophically. let's sort of go back to first principles and work out whether intellectually we can have more than one God existing. That's not the kind of discussion he's having. The kind of discussion, the kind of thing he's doing is showing the power and the authenticity of this God who can cause fire to come from heaven, and the other deity can't make that happen. And you can say the other deity is asleep, or he's, his mobile is off, or whatever it might be. But this is what it comes down to: is the existential choice of which God is to be worshipped and to be followed.
Appreciate that. So that brings us to maybe you already answered this. What would you say are the strongest texts that we have in the Bible that, in your eyes, think that make it pretty obvious that, hey, yeah, the Israelites or whoever the writers of the biblical text, they actually believed in multiple gods?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think because many of these texts do have this sort of monolatrous orientation to them, so they don't very often want to other deities are often not in their view. So some that I would think that are kind of interesting, and they are very often sort of texts that have undergone some sort of editing, not always, but often. So a text like, well, let's start on a basic level, even with Deuteronomy. So much of Deuteronomy's rhetoric is, if we look through the book of Deuteronomy, it is talking again and again of your God and our God. The Lord is your God, the Lord is our God. Even that vocabulary assumes the existence of other deities. That you shall have no other gods has as its sort of underlying assumption that there are other gods out there, and those other gods might actually be a possible recipient of the people of Israel's worship. So I think just on that level of the rhetoric of Deuteronomy, it's interesting that that's the case. There are texts that are interesting and problematic in their own way. Well, think of another one. Exodus 12:12 talks about the plagues as God bringing his judgments upon the gods of Egypt. Again, it's not qualified with words like, well, actually, dear reader, please understand, these are not actually gods. It's and not only that, but of course in the confrontation between Aaron and Pharaoh, it's assumed that the magicians can actually create a snake by throwing down their own staffs. They can turn the Nile into blood. They have some power. That the Egyptian religion has genuine power, but eventually they're bested. There eventually comes a point where they just have to kind of say, well, this is the finger of God. We're kind of we're out of this. We're done for. So we have texts like that. We have some texts which sort of allude, almost rather darkly, to the possibility of other powers being existing. So, for example, 2 Kings chapter 3, where the king of Moab sacrifices his firstborn son on the top of during a siege, presumably in order to kind of get his god to by offering up his firstborn son, he's offering the most important thing to him to get his own gods to defend him. And there's this sort of very opaque language of sort of wrath coming upon Israel, and they basically, the siege is broken and they head off home because of this sacrifice. So that's a kind of a rather sort of dark and elusive passage, but it seems to imply the existence of a deity that is in some way appeased by this offering. And then there are some texts that have been edited over time, and we are aware of them partly because of things like the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Deuteronomy 32 is a place where we find some of these texts that have been edited at some point. Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 reads, "When the Most High apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the people according to the number of," well, according to the number of what? The old King James Version, the older translations have according to the sons of Israel, which always seemed a little bit weird. Didn't quite make sense. And we know that the Dead Sea Scrolls has a reading, and it's shared also in the Septuagint. The Greek translation has a reading, the sons of God. This seems what the idea that's sitting behind that is that the all high God divides up the nations and gives them each to a sort of patron deity. And who is Israel's patron deity? Israel's patron deity is the Lord. And this is sort of reflecting an idea we find in some other places as well in the Hebrew Bible. It's sort of the heavenly realm is a sort of it's a kind of conference of the gods, or conference of divine beings. I mean, you see that, for example, at the beginning of Job. God is in his council in the heavens, and I'm not saying, what a fantastic guy my man Job is. And then Satan comes into this group and says, "Oh, well, actually, he's only your servant. He only admires you because you're so good to him. What about if you punish him?" And so again, we've sort of got this idea of it's almost sort of like a reflection upon the heavenly world of a royal court. God is a great king, and he has his own court. And in his court, he has his advisors, and these are the gods who sort of say one thing or another. And so that's the idea that we find in Deuteronomy 32 as well. And that seems to be probably the original reading, that these the God divides up the nations according to the numbers of the sons of God. And those sons of God appear again at the end of Deuteronomy 32, where they're all basically dragooned into giving God worship. So the whole of Deuteronomy 32 is it is describing God's actions on behalf of Israel, his gracious acts of salvation, but Israel is not always it does not always show gratitude, but the whole song is sort of showing us about how God is gracious to his people, and then eventually sort of ends right at the very end with the sort of declaration of God's power and might, and an insistence right at the end that all the sons of God come and bow down and worship God. And again, there's a sort of textual complexity there, and again, it looks as though the original reading of the text that we see from Qumran and also from the Septuagint has all the gods basically doing worship to the Lord and recognizing him as the one who's acted on behalf of his people and saved them.
I really appreciate the in-depth answer. A lot of good examples, and I'm sure you have many others as well. So that brings us to the topic of the monotheism and the Deuteronomy text, which is what you specifically focused on. So there's obviously a lot of misconceptions about this topic. You've talked about a couple here, but a lot of people might be like, "What are you talking about? The biblical text says Yahweh is one. It says, 'You shall have no other gods before me.' There is no other." So people might think that's almost a little obvious, but then you also talked about these other texts, and you're like, okay, well that's really interesting. But anyways, could you just talk about what you think is any other misconceptions worth mentioning before really get into the specific texts? It's okay if you don't have any.
I can't think of anything immediately.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. We'll just keep going then. All right.
Passages, yeah.
Okay, cool. Alrighty, so I'll just pull up the passage here. and it's somewhere on here. There it is. Alrighty. So Deuteronomy 4:35 says, "To you it was shown that you acknowledge the Lord is God. There is no other besides Him." So, I mean, people think, hey, if the Lord is God and there's no other besides Him, there's no other God besides Him, then how could you say that there's any other gods at all? So, how does that make sense to you?
Yeah, so part of the answer on this is, I think, looking, I think, in the larger context of this chapter. So Deuteronomy 4 is a very long sermon-like chapter, which is trying to draw out certain implications from the first three chapters, which have described Israel's experience in the wilderness. And it is absolutely about proclaiming the power and the uniqueness of Israel's God. But it's also doing so in the context of other nations having their own gods. So we have this allotment language again appearing in chapter 4, verse 19. When you look up at the heavens, you see the sun, moon, and stars, all the host of heaven. So these are the in various biblical texts regarded as sort of the deities that other nations worship. Don't be led astray by them. Don't go and worship them, because these are what God has allotted to all the peoples everywhere under heaven. So these are the deities that they're to have. It's not your deity. So within the larger context of Deuteronomy 4, the chapter is talking about the uniqueness of God within the context of other gods being mentioned. Very somewhat similarly, I think, if we go back to verse 7, we have all the nations sort of looking out, and they're seeing Israel, and they're seeing the law that God has given them, and they're saying, well, there's no other nation that's quite as wise and discerning as this people. What other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to Him? So again, it's sort of it's in the language of there being other gods, but that Israel's experience is unique, and God's actions, particularly shown through the Exodus and the giving of the law at Sinai, demonstrates His unique presence with Israel, that He's there with them in a way that no other deity is with their people. And this is what the chapter is sort of driving the people to acknowledge when we get to the very, very end of it. Some of the language and the way that this is typically being translated does make us think that it is an absolute statement of monotheism, and indeed, many scholars do think that is the case. And I tried to push back a little bit on that. I think there's a couple of ways of understanding it that might suggest something different. Some people have sort of talked about a kind of more rhetorical, a sort of heightened, almost rhetorical monotheism. So it's a sort of it's more about language than it is again, rather than necessarily that there's a sort of then they actually believe that that no other gods exist, but this is a sort of very strong rhetorical way of emphasizing that the Lord is Israel's God. I tried to push a little bit further and say that actually this language, the Lord is God, there is no other, ein od. If we look at some of the other places in the Hebrew Bible, doesn't mean the absolute non-existence of other beings. And an example of that would be a very similar statement that we get in Isaiah, where Babylon sort of says, I am there alone, there is no other. And this isn't Babylon saying, I'm the only city there is, which would be a preposterous claim to make, but is simply a claim, that there is no other city that's like me. So so this language of there is no other is actually probably better seen as a claim about incomparability. It's not so much a claim of monotheism, but it is that there is no other God that is like the God of Israel. That he is unique. He is the only one who can actually claim to be God with a capital G. And he has shown this through his actions towards Israel and in the way that he's saved them and the way that he's spoken to them at Mount Sinai.
I appreciate that. Yeah, so at least from my point of view here, it seems like maybe I'm missing something in the Hebrew. I haven't specifically looked at it, but it says the Lord is God. It doesn't say the Lord is God, there is no other gods beside him. It just says there is no other. So I guess the question is, what does it mean by there's no other? Does it mean that there's no other great gods beside him? There is no other great, deities? Is it talking about a specific quality, or is it talking about a specific quality of being God in general, or a God? And it seems like you're saying, hey, no, there's it's not specific, and the other context seems to imply that it's talking about the greatness of God, right?
Yeah, and many other scholars have wanted to sort of drive a wedge between this, have wanted to say this passage is, like no other passage in Deuteronomy, is actually stepping fully through the door into monotheism. That there are other passages in Deuteronomy that come close to this, but never actually make this absolute claim. So again, if we were to go to Deuteronomy 32, I would say here in Deuteronomy 32 that a very similar claim is being made, where it says, chapter 32, verse 39, see now that even I am he, and there is no God. Again, very similar vocabulary, ve'ein Elohim, there is no God, imadi, with me. So there's God didn't take Israel, didn't save Israel, with somebody at his side helping him. He did this alone, and he has demonstrated his absolute power and authority on his own. He didn't. He wasn't part of a gang, and I think this is so my view is that sort of Deuteronomy 32, 39 is much closer to Deuteronomy 4 than some scholars would see, and that it is actually about whether there is no other God with him that's acting present on earth and actively in this way, in the way that God has acted for Israel.
Fascinating. All right, so let's talk about Deuteronomy 4:39. It's just slightly different, but it says, so acknowledge today and take to heart that the Lord is God in heaven above, and on the earth beneath there is no other. So would you say that's the similar language there? It says there's no other. It says the Lord is God. Same thing there, would you say?
It's very similar. The only difference really from verse 35 is this additional claim that the Lord is God in heaven above and on the earth below, and this seems to be associated with the Sinai revelation. That the Sinai revelation in Deuteronomy 4 is this astonishing moment that God actually is present with his people on Mount Sinai. And this idea that sort of this moment God actually comes right up close to them. I mean, this is a similar claim as we would see in the priestly literature in Exodus 40. But this claim about God is in heaven and above and on the earth beneath is actually linked to the kind of claim that's being made about Sinai, that actually they heard the voice and they saw the fire. So there are this sort of heavenly and earthly aspect, and that this divine presence is both with them, we might say immanent, and it's also transcendent. So it's So God is both the heavenly God and is actually kind of present with them. And the writers here in Deuteronomy 4 is particularly drawing a contrast with other gods, and in particular that these other gods are sort of seen either in the heavens, or that they are actually not really present with the people. And so when they Israel is told, when you go into exile, what you'll see is you'll worship other gods that are made by human hands. You won't actually have the real presence of God there. All you'll have is a wooden object. So it's not so much that is saying, oh well, these aren't real gods because they're just word. It's actually about the divine presence with the people. And again, it's what I wanted to do is emphasize that this is this existential claim that is being made. This question of kind of that God is, the writer is not trying to convince the people of a fact. There is only one God. And if you say there are two, you've made a category error or a conceptual mistake. What he's trying to convince them of is that God is with you. If you obey this law, at Sinai, he was with you. And if you obey this law, he will continue to be present with you as the God who acts on your behalf and saves you.
Appreciate that. Okay, next you talked about in your dissertation Deuteronomy 5. So let's pull that one up. And that was 5:7, which was, or let's start 6. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So this one's a little different. You shall have no other gods before me.
Yeah, and this is a long discussed passage. Literally it means you shall have no other gods upon my face. That would be a literal translation, but what does that mean? Does it mean have no other gods except for me? Does that mean, as some have suggested, that it means sort of no gods, no idols sort of next to God's image in the temple? So it's or should we translate this something like over and against me? For me, what again, it's important to see that this is not. This is a commandment. It's requiring the Israelites to do something. It's not asking them to come to a certain kind of intellectual decision. It's actually about, who do you acknowledge as God? Who do you give worship to? To whom do you sacrifice? So these very sort of practical questions are being raised by Deuteronomy 5. And this language of you shall have no other gods before me, allows the possibility that other gods may exist. Most scholars are fairly convinced this is not, strictly speaking, a monotheistic statement. At least on this one, I'm in fairly good company, because it's part of the rhetoric that you have elsewhere in Deuteronomy about there being our God, I am your God, that there are other potential claims upon Israel's loyalty, but that only the Lord is the one who's to receive it, and is to receive this worship. The language is interesting. What's interesting about this? Not all biblical books are saying the same things, nor are they saying them in the same way. Deuteronomy is very happy to talk about, to use this language of other gods, and we might contrast that in rather interesting ways with Ezekiel. Ezekiel cannot even bear the idea, it would seem, of calling these gods, and he mostly uses fairly scatological language to describe them. They're balls of dung, or their abominations. There are different ways in which the biblical writers sort of make these claims to their readers about who is to receive cultic devotion, and Deuteronomy is quite happy to talk about these as other gods. but to insist that that the Israelites are only to worship God alone. And that idea sort of continues, I suppose, if you go, you read on in Deuteronomy 5 verse 8 and then into verse 9, this idea of God being a passionate God, a jealous God. This is language of, this is emotional language of human relationships. It's not quite the kind of philosophical language that we might think of in relation to something like monotheism. This is the God is expecting this cultic commitment and this exclusivity of Israel's devotion, and if he doesn't receive it, then he's prepared to punish the people. So jealousy again is sort of very emotive, and again, the balance of where Deuteronomy's rhetoric is not sort of, well, you've made an intellectual error here. That's not the kind of language that's being used. Rather, it's the language of jealousy. Actually, when we use that language of jealousy, there's somebody that we might be jealous about, somebody that has stolen Israel's affection.
Thank you for that. All right, and next one we have is Deuteronomy 6:4, which says, "Hear, O Israel, O the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So it's very similar to the other passage. Did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, this is a great text, very famous text, which yes, bring up the footnote, which could be translated in so many different ways. The reason for this is that it is what is called grammatically a nominal sentence. In other words, it's only got nouns in it. So as interpreters, we're faced with this is not uncommon in Hebrew that you have nominal sentences, but we then have the problem of determining what is the subject and what's the predicate, or to put it slightly more plainly, where do we put the word is in English as we're translating. So we've got four words: the Lord, the Tetragrammaton, the divine name; our God, which is one word in Hebrew, Eloheinu; our God, the Lord, one. So we've got these four words: the Lord, our God, the Lord, one. And the question then is what is the subject, what is the predicate? And there's at least four ways essentially of doing this. You can either say the Lord is our God, the Lord alone; the Lord our God is the only Lord, translating one as sort of only or something like that. Or you can translate it as the Lord our God, the Lord is one, as you've got here. And then the final way is to sort of make it into two sentences: the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And those different translations can carry different nuances. What I think would be true is that there's a fair amount of hesitation amongst biblical scholars about seeing this as a statement about what God is in himself or substantially, which is how sometimes the Lord is one has been understood. God is sort of undivided. He's he's not a sort of separate entity. He can't be divided into separate entities or whatever. And one of the reasons for that is that this is actually in the Hebrew closely linked with the verse that follows, which is not always brought out in many translations, or indeed the one that you've got showing here, where often just love the Lord your God is sort of juxtaposed with hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But love the Lord is actually here seen as the consequence of this claim. So it's connected by a Hebrew vav, and so we might translate this better as sort of hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And so here again, we can see the way that this claim that is being made is tightly bound to this insistence that Israel's affections, its commitment, most importantly within the context of Deuteronomy, the obedience that is to follow, that all of that is directed to God. So it's not so much about sort of the internal, is God one, or is he divided, or is he? But it's actually, again, this issue of loyalty, and in the dissertation I compared it to Song of Songs, chapter 6, verse 9. I'm not at all the first one to have made this comparison, but I do think it's a relevant one, and that's where the lover says about his beloved, there are 60 queens and there are 80 concubines and maidens without number. So the person that I'm in love with, my beloved, she really is not the only woman out there. I mean, she isn't. There are lots and lots of other candidates. And then says in verse 9, she, my dove, my perfect one, is one. And this language of one is again used in a context of, yes, there are other women. I'm more than aware that there are other women out there, but actually, she's my beloved. She's my one. And again, it's this sort of loyalty, this commitment. It's the kind. It's the kind of language maybe that a sports supporter would use. There's only one Manchester United, or there's only one New England Patriots, or whatever it might be. It's that sort of sense of sort of absolute kind of commitment and devotion. You wouldn't even think about following another team. That wouldn't even cross your mind. And that's what the writer is wanting to press upon us in Deuteronomy 6. There are larger questions that have sort of revolved around that passage. It's often been seen as, it's really seen as one of the purple passages of the book of Deuteronomy. And some scholars have argued that it really was the beginning of the original Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is by scholars seen as quite a complex book with a complex history. But some scholars have argued that this was really almost like the opening statement. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And that it was bound very closely to the central claim that is made in Deuteronomy 12 to 18, the oldest part of the law code, that Israel's worship was to be centralized to one place, often thought to be Jerusalem. And so this has also been kind of connected closely with the Josianic reform. A scholar like Rainer Alberts has sort of claimed that this is the slogan, the watchword of the Deuteronomic Reformation, the Josianic Reformation. That claim I'm really quite cautious about, which is, I suppose, an academic way of saying I think it's wrong. I'm not sure this is the opening of the original Deuteronomy. Not least because one of the strange things about this claim, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, is that when we look into the rest of the Deuteronomistic history, so if we look into sort of Samuel and Kings, when very strong monolatrous claims are being made, this is not the language they use. And in fact, we don't find, one of the strange things about this passage, which of course is so familiar to us, it's what Jesus calls the greatest commandment. It's a crucially important confession, central confession within later Judaism, and yet surprisingly, we don't find an echo of it in the Hebrew Bible until very, very late. We find it echoed in Zechariah 14 verse 9, so in so-called Deutero-Zechariah, where the prophet expresses a wish that, one day, or the expectation that one day God, surprisingly, will be one and his name one. That in itself is a sort of an interesting claim, which sort of pushes back against any sort of simplistic claim about monotheism. What does it mean to say that the Lord will be one? Does it kind of mean he's not one now? So it's a very different kind of claim that's being made. It's not that sort of God is sort of, at the moment he's sort of not monotheistic, but one day he will be. It's that one day he is going to be acknowledged by the whole earth. And then there's also an echo of it in Malachi chapter 2, where God is said to be kind of one, maybe one father. And so it's sort of interesting that actually Deuteronomy 6 verse 4 doesn't have the sort of it's not picked up in the way that we might expect if it was some great Deuteronomic slogan, or if it was the watchword of the Josianic Reformation. And actually, in some ways, it doesn't become, this language really gets picked up almost actually in most substantial ways, actually in the Greco-Roman period, where we get the development towards what I've kind of called a kind of theology, a oneness theology, where you start getting theological reflections on what it means to say that God is one. And so Josephus does some of this, and Philo does some of this, and Paul does some of this as well. So you sort of, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. So there is a kind of unity that's expressed here. But this is a sort of, again, one almost feels that it's perhaps that encounter between Judaism and sort of Hellenistic philosophy and thought that's sort of encouraging writers to think in these ways of trying to sort of think out what is the kind of coherence to various things and these kind of claims that God is one. Does that just, what does that mean? Does that have any implications beyond a confession that God is one? If God is one, it means for Josephus, there can only be one temple. Or there can only be one people that's his. So these kinds of reflections begin to emerge, particularly in sort of Greco-Roman period. I think that's in some ways that sort of brings us onto a sort of another interesting reflection about some of this language around monotheism. And that is that this what we might call elevated monolatrous claims. The Lord is God, there is no other. The kind of thing that we find in Deuteronomy, often in some of the later parts of Deuteronomy, the language that we find in some parts of Kings at certain key places, or the language we find in 2nd Isaiah, is kind of very short-lived. It sort of has its moment in the sun, so to speak, and isn't found so much in later periods. And I think that's partly is related to its particular religio-historical context. So these are claims that are being made, particularly when Israel and Judah are experiencing the Babylonian exile. They're confronted with the power of the Babylonian Empire and the claims about Babylonian gods. And we see that particularly in 2nd Isaiah. And it's in this context that these very strong rhetorical claims about monolatry are being made. And then they kind of don't endure. And we often get very different kinds of claims once we get to the Persian period. Once we get into the Persian period, if you think about the priestly literature, if you think about Ezra and Nehemiah, it's much more of a claim. The language often uses sort of the writers talk about the God of heaven, and this is a way in which they can make appeals to the Persian authorities, often by kind of they use the language of God of heaven, and what they mean by it is the God of Israel, the Lord. But they're looking for a common language that the Persians will hear as Ahura Mazda, the Persian chief god. So there's, we see through these different periods different kind of approaches to thinking and talking about God in different contexts that Israel experiences. And again, I think that just sort of cautions us, or should caution us, to think carefully about what exactly is going on in Deuteronomy and Second Isaiah. It belongs in this very particular religious context in which Israelite belief and practice is under considerable pressure externally, but also in the affections of the Israelites. The experience of the fall of Jerusalem, the end of the monarchy, for many of them probably put Israelite belief and practice into question. They had fought against the great Babylonian Empire, and they had been defeated. And that meant not only that they had been defeated, but also, the God in whom they had trusted had also been bested by the Babylonian gods. And it's in that context that we get these high rhetorical claims about God, and this insistence, sort of, we might say, not to lose faith, and to keep on showing the Lord cultic devotion and the commitment.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's very exhaustive, but I really do appreciate that extra detail. So we're a little bit over the hour mark here. So we have 2 or 3 other verses here that I was hoping you to get to, but that's okay. Do you have extra time to go through those, or should we do this at a different time?
I've got time, and I guess your listeners can sort of turn us off when they're bored.
If I have any idea, I don't think they would have. I think they'll be following through with this one. This is a really good one. All right, so I think we did 6-4. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
we
we
did
did.
6-4. All right. Next one here is 7-9. So that is. Know, therefore, that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who maintains covenant loyalty with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. So this is, it's just saying the Lord your God is God. Some people have interpreted that as he's the only God. Could you talk about that and what your thoughts on this passage?
Yeah, and it's not dissimilar from the kind of claim that's made in Deuteronomy 4. Similar language is used again. And we've got this interesting juxtaposition here, both that he is your God, the Lord your God, but also he is making this claim, the book of Deuteronomy is making the claim for him that he is also the God. He is God with a capital G, in a way that no other God is. So, if you want to call that monotheism, I think you can do. That's absolutely fine. But it's very much kind of making this claim about loyalty. And you can see that indeed as the verse goes on. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He's been faithful to you. He's maintained covenant loyalty with you, with those who love him and keep his commandments. And then verse 11, you get the therefore, you in response have to show loyalty to him. So again, it is absolutely making a claim about the uniqueness of God, but again, it's insisting that the people show God the loyalty that here in this verse he's claiming also he's shown them.
That's really, really cool. Yeah, the NET commentary has something interesting. It says pretty conservative, but it says Hebrew the God, or the article here expresses uniqueness, is the only God, is indeed God. So fascinating. You didn't have any thoughts on that before we keep going, did you?
No, I think even there you can see, commentators sort of trying to deal with the various different aspects of the kinds of claims that Deuteronomy is trying to press upon its readership. And I think it's a place where kind of that language of monotheism, which expresses maximally intellectual ideas, doesn't quite seem to capture everything that's going on here. And again, the language that can sometimes mislead us, because we read something like know that the Lord, and again we think maximally about intellectual commitments, whereas actually know that is a claim that is immediately followed on by certain requirements and obligations that are it's not a kind of oh, I know that, that's okay, here's a fact that I know. It's very much pushing towards and keep the commandment and the statutes and the ordinances. So there are very clear practical consequences, clear indications of loyalty that follow. And I mean, it's the other thing that we could and maybe ought to say about Deuteronomy is that the writer of Deuteronomy has appropriated here the form of international treaties, and this has long been observed. Deuteronomy is very interesting because it's a blending of the international treaty form, but with traditional legal material inserted as the stipulations. So we've kind of got in the middle part, we've got something that reminds us quite a lot of the Code of Hammurabi, and other legal texts in the Hebrew Bible, like Exodus 21 to 23, but it's all been said in this covenant context, this sort of international treaty idea, where these international treaties are where, with the good examples that we have, the closest parallels we have to Deuteronomy is where the Assyrians have imposed treaties on subject nations and upon subject kings, and require them to do certain things that show their loyalty and fulfill their loyalty to the Assyrians. What we seem to have in Deuteronomy is a sort of astonishing moment of appropriating this idea, but actually saying to the readers, your loyalty isn't to the Assyrian king; it's to God. And this language of loving God is very similar to the language that is seen in some of the Assyrian treaties about loving the Assyrian king. It's about loyalty. And again, whenever we're talking about this language about loyalty, and it's very clear when we're talking about international treaties, it's the Assyrian kings are aware that loyalty could be shown to somebody else. That's exactly why they're imposing these treaties upon these nations. And it's this sort of idea that is being adopted by Deuteronomy.
I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I'm aware that a lot of scholars argue that what we have here is a Hittite suzerain treaty, but you're saying it's Assyrian. What are your thoughts there? Do you disagree with that claim? Or am I thinking of a different idea?
No, I mean it certainly would be I would say something of a dividing line between many critical scholars who recognize very strong parallels, particularly in places like Deuteronomy 28 and 27. Many of the curses are very, very close, it would seem, to what we have in the vassal treaty of Esarhaddon. We do also know treaties from Hittite Empire. Our largest. I think we can assume that treaties were used by other polities at different points, but our two caches that we have from the ancient Near East are Hittite treaties from 14th, 13th century BCE, and these Assyrian treaties from the 8th, 7th century. My own view on this is that this was a kind of political form that was very useful. It probably existed at other periods. It probably existed in the Babylonian period, although some people have doubted that. And the reason that we end up knowing this very well from, say, Assyrian treaties or Hittite treaties is that we are at least partially beholden to what is to the vicissitudes of archaeology and what's been discovered. You get what you're given with archaeology, and one of the things you're aware of with particularly with written caches and material is that you're only getting a sort of keyhole, often only getting a keyhole view into a room, and various parts of it are dark, or you can't see them. And that really is our challenge with a lot of ancient Near Eastern texts. So yeah, most of our treaties that we know from the ancient world are either Hittites or these Assyrian treaties, but certainly the verbal parallels between the vassal treaty of Esarhaddon and texts like Deuteronomy 28 seem to me to be decisive.
Interesting.
And it also fits with the fact that we know that Deuteronomy is the book that is discovered in the reign of Josiah. This has been appreciated since Jerome. The book of the law is Deuteronomy, and of course, many critical scholars think that Deuteronomy was we might say written in order to be discovered, but that its origins are from the 7th century rather than from a much earlier period. But certainly the idea of sort of a Hittite origin has been attractive, I think, particularly to those who want to see an origin closer to the putative time of a historical Moses.
Right. Yeah. So, but the logic, the reason you bring it up would still be the same either way, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's Hittite or not.
For my purposes, it does the same thing. Yeah. No, absolutely. These are, I mean, it's dramatic. I mean, I could sit here and talk about covenant for hours. I mean, this is a decisive moment, I think, in both for the Hebrew Bible, but also sort of and the theologies that come from it, because in Deuteronomy, this is the moment when this international treaty form is being appropriated, and it's creating this it's being attacked. It's being utilized for the purposes of explaining, if you follow the law, then God will bless you. If you don't follow it, he'll punish you. And this, seems to fit very well with how, this is a dramatic moment. This kind of metaphor has not been used before. It's a fresh appropriation, but it kind of seems to fit in various ways with how ancient Judahites understood their relationship to God. And then, this idea of a covenant sort of spreads through, you find it in being appropriated and picked up in all parts of the Hebrew Bible in various ways and applied to different groups. So originally it is used of God and Israel, but it will come to be used of Noah, it'll be used of Abraham, it will be used of the priests, it'll be, even of the Levites. So this just becomes an enormously influential idea. And then, of course, on into Christianity and into various sort of forms of Christian theology as well. So, but Deuteronomy is almost certainly the moment of this idea sort of taking shape.
That's really, really cool. Okay, thank you. All right, next we have Deuteronomy 10. That would be 10:17, which says, there you go. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribes. So this seems to lead into a lot more of your view. If he's saying God of gods, that seems to imply that there are other gods. Is there any way to see this in a monotheistic view that you know of, or is this pretty clear in your eyes?
I mean, in my eyes, it's fairly clear. And I think, I mean, this is, I mean, it's both claiming the uniqueness and the supremacy of Israel's God, whilst also doing so precisely within the context that other gods exist. So no, I mean, it's, I mean, for my purposes, precisely the kinds of things that I'm wanting to argue. We find very similar things elsewhere. Here, I mean, very interesting, of course, because as you can see, it's linked to the idea of being impartial, the idea of, this is judicial language that's being appropriated here as sort of language that's often used in the ancient Near East of the righteous king, who's not partial, doesn't take bribes, does justice for those who are marginalized in society, the orphan and the widow, and loves the stranger. And some of these ideas are picked up in other places as well, which also touch upon the discussion of monotheism, very famously Psalm 82, where God again is sort of sitting amongst his council, and he sees the gods, and he gets cross with them because they're not executing justice and righteousness, and he condemns them all to death. So the gods can die in the view of Psalm 82, but it's attached to this idea of justice. So again, it's and of generosity towards the weak and the poor in society. So it's both very interesting in relationship to kind of royal sort of ideals of the royal king, but also again, I think it's these claims are being made in, to our eyes, a very different conceptual universe, in which God's character and the claims that are being made about him are really tightly bound to his actions, to the kind of character that he's shown in his acts of salvation and in his continued acts of generosity to the poor and the weak. And again, it's sort of whether or not one feels that monotheism is well applied to some of these statements, we're going to need to say something more, something slightly different to make sense of some of these verses and the particular things that they're expressing. Monotheism doesn't easily capture these sorts of claims about divine justice and divine generosity and his commitment to those to his people and to those who lack.
That's really fascinating. I think you kind of commented on this earlier, but it says Deuteronomy 32:39. See now that even I am he. There is no God besides me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal. No one can deliver from my hand. Anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean it's really so. I mean, where it says sort of beside me, Imadi is I mean really kind of with me. There is no and here we're having the implications of the existential implications of divine authority and power. That it's not just a simple kind of intellectual acknowledgement, but actually this is the one who has shown the rest of Deuteronomy 32 is this sort of history of God's dealings with Israel, that he is the one who kills and he makes alive, he wounds and he heals. So it's about the power that he has. Ultimately, you'll see that it's I kill and I make alive. So the narrative direction is towards the living and the healing, but Deuteronomy 32 is not dewy-eyed. This is written by Israelites and Judahites who have experienced really difficult situations, but it is an expression of sort of that hope that actually God is the God of salvation, that he brings life, he brings healing, and he delivers. This is language actually, I mean, Deuteronomy 32:39 comes very close to the kind of language that we see in Second Isaiah as well. This sort of salvific language. And the idea that sort of God is both, I mean, we get language that actually sits a little bit in tension with Genesis 1, but the idea that sort of God does good and he does weal and he does woe, he does good and he does evil. He creates light and he creates darkness. So there is a sort of, I mean, this is an interesting text because it it is resisting a kind of, we might say, a kind of yin yang view of the universe. It doesn't allow there to be a demiurge or a sort of demonic other side to God, a demonic other side that isn't God. It's kind of saying, actually, God is the author of all these things.
Awesome, thank you. Let's go with Deuteronomy 33:26 now. So this one's just as fun. There is none like God, O Jeshurun, who rides through the heavens to your help, majestic through the clouds. Which is, so this is real fun because it says there is none like God. So, okay, people say, okay, there's none like God, so there's no other gods. But then the next passage says, he subdues the ancient gods, shatters the forces of old. So what do you think about this text?
Yeah, I mean, we have to say, first of all, verse 26 is very much an incomparability statement. So, there is none like God. So it's expressing that he's incomparable rather than he's, there is no other God. And it's using a lot of this divine warrior imagery that we find in various other parts of the Old Testament. His power is shown through the defeat of other deities, and in particular here, those who would threaten Israel's existence, or Israel's flourishing. So you kind of see that as it goes on. He drove out the enemy before you and said, destroy, so Israel lives in safety. So, yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful passage. But it also, again, is drawing on very different kind of sort of conceptual universe. This very much idea of sort of God as the divine warrior, amongst other divine warriors. He fights against them and he wins. And of course, we see this in various other different places. We see this language often echoed in the Psalms. Often creation is talked about in this sort of language, God defeating the sea monsters in order to kind of create a world for humanity or for his people in which they can flourish. So yeah, this is kind of a motif that we can find in other parts of the Hebrew Bible.
That's really, really cool. So there was two other things that I was really hoping you would comment on if you have time. One, and it's okay if you don't, Isaiah, because there's a lot of texts in Isaiah that seem to be very monotheistic looking. Did you have any quick thoughts you wanted to add there? Did you have anything prepared for that?
Yeah, I'm not the only one who's looked at Second Isaiah, and you're right. We encounter very similar issues that we encounter in Deuteronomy 4. Very similar language is used. I'm not entirely alone in thinking that actually we might be better to think of this as more rhetorical. So Saul Olien has written a very nice essay back in 2012, I think. Is Deutero-Isaiah monotheistic, I think, or something like that. And even sort of people like James Barr, felt very similarly that it was sort of, or Chris Seitz, sort of elevated, rhetorically elevated claims of the elevated form of monolatry, rhetorical form of monolatry, rather than necessarily, again, that if we're thinking about what Second Isaiah is trying to do, he's trying to encourage, discourage people, that God's salvation is nigh, and that the Creator God is going to come and act on their behalf. So it's a text which is talking about the gods of Babylon. It's talking about the idols of Babylon. It's dismissing them quite a bit, treating them as wood and stone, but this is the claim. It's doing so again in a context where the Babylonian gods, genuinely seem to have power, and seem to have dictated Israel's existence, and he's and God is actually coming in and proclaiming that he will that he will save and perhaps bring the people back to Jerusalem.
Mhm. What text do you have in mind there that reference other gods having power in Isaiah?
Yeah, I mean, in Isaiah we have a lot of we have this sort of passages that sort of talk about idol polemic. So we've got and we've got sort of we have some texts as well that speak about particular deities. So Isaiah 46 verse 1 talks about Bel bowing down, Nebo stooping. These are the peoples of Babylon. You know, sort of what they visited on others will now be visited on them. So they're sort of heading out of town with their idols on their animals and sort of carrying them out. And there's sometimes been the suggestion that we might have here a sort of rather polemical take on the kind of procession festivals that were characteristic of Babylonian worship, where the god of the deity was sort of processed around as part of some of the festivals. And yeah, the writer is directly talking about some of these deities, and also we have quite a bit in Second Isaiah of the prophet seems to know something of the Babylonian initiation rituals for deities. There are these sort of mouth opening ceremonies which sort of birth the gods or birth the idols and ensure that they are, from the perspective of the Babylonians, they are actually not human creations, but they are divine creations. They are made in heaven. And the prophet is sort of taking some of this language and sort of flipping it around and using it as a sort of polemic against the other gods, again as part of this sort of this insistence upon the salvific act of Israel's God that is about to be revealed.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm sure someone's going to be thinking, you said the Isaiah text, they're just being rhetorical. They don't actually, believe there's only one God. But couldn't someone just say that about the other Deuteronomy texts where they refer to other gods? Or they're just being rhetorical or hyperbolic or whatever. Do you see that as any possibility, or is that, just making things up?
Yeah, I mean, scholarship being what it is, I take a particular view on this, and different scholars take a different view on it, and so some scholars are more prepared to think that what we see in Second Isaiah and what we see in some of the texts in Deuteronomy, mostly Deuteronomy 4, is thoroughly monotheistic and denies the existence of other deities. They just do not exist. So the nature of scholarship is that scholars disagree and try to make arguments in various directions for what they think. I would say it's certainly the case. One of the difficulties, one of the things that concerns me about the monotheism discussion is that some of the language that was used was often sort of seen as a breakthrough. It was almost seen as sort of something that kind of once this intellectual breakthrough was made, there was kind of no going back. It was sort of like it was, and I think in my own mind, I often felt it was a little bit like the Copernican revolution. It's kind of like once you've realized that the sun is the center of the solar system, there's no way of sort of going back. It doesn't make any sense. You can't go back to being a flat earther or whatever. And I'm not sure it's helpful to think in that way. And I think increasing, one of the things that is apparent is that there is still an awful lot of speculation about the divine world and divine beings that goes on in Second Temple Judaism, for example, but even in Judaism and Christianity in later periods as well. So there isn't a kind of moment where monotheism is sort of attached as a moment from which you can't resile, and from then on you can only imagine a world in which there is one God and there are no other divine beings. The kinds of speculations that are going on in the Second Temple period are many and various. So the university, if you look at Enoch, or if you're looking at lots of Second Temple texts, they have a much, they've got a universe that is populated with all kinds of sort of divine beings of various different gradations. Now, again, it's not necessarily to say that they kind of think that transgresses upon the sovereignty and uniqueness of the Lord, but they're prepared to operate with various different kinds of speculations. Some of them more metaphysical, some of them, of different sorts. So, I think we're trying. Myself and other scholars are all trying to. We're all trying to make sense of the literature we have, which is. Which gives us a limited vista into what people were believing.
Yeah, so just for some clarity there, so was there anything specific that, you've probably mentioned, maybe so if you could summarize in that case, was there anything specific that you think that with those other Deuteronomy passages, like, there's no way this is rhetorical, like, this seems to be heavily favoring the idea that, like, they actually did think that there were other gods, but Yahweh was just the Most High?
So I would say for what I'm arguing, Deuteronomy 4 verses 35 and 39 are the most difficult texts. So those are the texts that more scholars have been convinced are kind of a true full monotheism. But most scholars on Deuteronomy are fairly convinced that that is not the case for Deuteronomy 6 verse 4. It's not the case for the Decalogue. You shall have no other gods before me. That those texts implicitly allow, or even explicitly allow, for the existence of other deities. Mm-hmm. So it's also a question of and so therefore it's also kind of tightly bound up with questions of what scholars think about the development and the redaction of the Book of Deuteronomy, and whether in fact we've got, whether we have, say, someone like Georg-August would think that we have a sort of an earlier book that was much more kind of monolatrous, which has then been sort of given a monotheistic packaging, such that when you read Deuteronomy, in his view, Deuteronomy 4 verses 35 and 39 are monotheistic. Mm-hmm. And so therefore you read Deuteronomy 6 verse 4 with the lenses that have been given you by Deuteronomy 4 verse 35 and 39, so that when you get to Deuteronomy 6 verse 4, you kind of go, oh, well, I still understand this as a monotheistic way. I mean, that's how he would understand it. And I think that's a very interesting argument, and it's not necessarily one I agree with, but I think it's a plausible, it's certainly a plausible way of reading the text, and things to be said for it.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, especially when you get into the different redactional layers and all that kind of stuff, for the scholars that do hold that, because you can have one text that is, you'd say, oh, that it clearly believes in multiple gods, and then the next one decided, it's like, okay, well, this one's clearly monotheistic, and if you have different sources or whatever, then
and I think that at least some of my cautions, I mean, I would, I'm quite happy to work with redaction critical theories, and do so with some of my other works. But I think particularly with, I think I am quite cautious, particularly on this issue, but on certain, whenever we're thinking of religious theological ideas, we just need to sort of apply those sorts of theories with quite a lot of care, because there is a danger that certainly one of the worries that was sort of sitting behind the thesis was the concern that the religio-historical idea about development was in significant ways sort of driving the sense of how the book had developed. I think there are probably better clues that one might use for redaction critical analysis. I do believe it's important, and I think there are ways of doing it well.
But there's an aspect of what the final layer is. So if you want to say, hey, what did the final editor, or final, whatever that means, final editors, I guess the form we have today,
And
they probably, based on, even if maybe there was a text that was originally monotheistic, there are other texts that were clearly polytheistic, or not polytheistic, but they believed other gods. So the person that ascribed to those polytheistic texts, you would say that they probably reinterpreted the other text hypothetically, or you don't think they would just ignore it, would you?
What ancient readers do with ancient texts is always interesting. Well, what modern readers do with ancient texts is also interesting and fascinating. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think we end up with very particular senses of what we think people do with texts, which are not always the case. I mean, if we think particularly of Deuteronomy, where Deuteronomy has this very strong view of that worship should take place simply. Sacrificial worship should only take place at the place that God has chosen, which is usually thought to mean that there should only be one sanctuary. We're increasingly finding in the Second Temple period that we now know that there were several temples. Yeah, I mean, you can go to a writer like Josephus. I mean, Josephus is absolutely convinced there should be only one temple. He has this oneness theology. But that's partly because he's a Hasmonean, or he tells us he's from the family of the Hasmoneans. So, he's really, really committed to Jerusalem. He has a reason to be. But we know that there was a temple at Elephantine in the 5th century. There was a temple at Leontopolis until around 70 AD. We know there was a sanctuary at Tel Motza. We know that the Samaritans had a sanctuary around Gerizim. So, and all of them, I'm probably not the group at Elephantine, but several of these groups may well have had Deuteronomy. And they can quite happily read Deuteronomy, and all it says about God. You should only do sacrificial worship at the place that God will choose, and they can read that and they kind of go, yeah, whatever. Ancient readers, just like modern readers, have very different ways of reading text. But I think the question that you're raising at the beginning is an absolutely fair one, which is there are different ways that we can work with texts. We can absolutely legitimately say, how would we can think about its history, we can and how it might have developed over time. We can also take a final form approach. I think how might a reader have responded to it. I mean, these are all legitimate ways of working with text, and they have their own particular value. I mean, it's the same way you go around my city of Cambridge. Architecturally, you can go around with an architectural historian and they'll say, well, this building is 15th century and this is 18th century. But, that's a lot of value from doing that. But you can also live and work and inhabit those buildings. Those are different ways of being, and they're perfectly legitimate.
All right. I don't want to take too much of your time. I keep saying this, but I was really curious about Deuteronomy 32, your view, 8 and 9. Lots of scholars obviously think that El and Elyon and Yahweh are two distinct people in this text, and there's a lot of different things going on there. Do you have any specific view there?
Yeah, gosh, it's a fascinating text, and whether it's still there. I think if we're reading Deuteronomy 32 now, it absolutely has to be the case that Elyon and the Lord are basically seen as the same deity. But I think it probably does suggest, that there is an earlier, behind this text, or maybe even an earlier version. There is this idea that Elyon, the Most High, there's an El Elyon, and potentially that the Lord was seen as one amongst many deities, with El Elyon as the superior deity. I think that's perfectly possible. Yeah, I mean, one area where I've always wondered is this this dual textual tradition that we have. I mean, on the one hand, that we have the sons of Israel in the Hebrew text, that's the Masoretic text, the traditional text, and then we have the Dead Sea Scrolls also attested to by the Septuagint, that we have the sons of God. And the usual explanation of that is that the some later scribe is sort of reading this and sort of gets very sort of upset at the idea of there being other gods, and sort of therefore changes it to the sons of Israel. And I did speculate in the monograph, although just in a sort of a side note, that I wondered actually whether this was actually came into the text as a gloss rather than as a deliberate apologetic revision of the text, because all the way through the Song of Moses we have reference being made to the sons. This idea is right there from the beginning. He's a faithful God in verse 4, and yet you've been degenerate children, degenerate sons. So this language of sons is used all the way through, and then you get this reference in 32 verse 8 to the sons of God. And I think I can also imagine a situation where it wasn't deliberately changed because it was worried about it being polytheistic, but actually somebody's, well, who are these sons of God? And that somebody might have just put in the margin, this is Israel, because that is who the sons are all the way through the song. Apart from here, where we've got this sort of little play on the sons of God. So I've always wondered whether this was more of a sort of a gloss that entered into the text rather than a deliberate polemical change. But I mean, we won't ever know. But I think there's different ways of thinking about this problem.
That's really, really cool. Thank you so much for commenting on that. Yeah, so it's been awesome having you on. Very, very in-depth, which I really do appreciate. A lot of great scholarly work here. So for people not familiar with your work, I wanted to show people. So you've done a number of different fun things, such as you've done some work on the Hebrews and Christian theology, Genesis and Christian theology. You did a book on what the ancient Israelites ate. So this is a little too small. One of your most recent books there, The Making of the Tabernacle and the Construction of Priestly Hegemony, and a few other texts here as well. So people check out your work if you want to learn more about what Dr. MacDonald's doing here. Anything else you want to plug there?
No, thank you very much. No, that was very kind of you to mention all of those.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to have you more on. There's a lot of also fun stuff here. But otherwise, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe. Make sure you subscribe if you didn't like it, so that you can watch the next one, because I'm sure you'll like that one as well. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming on. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Thanks very much.